What if the greatest tragedies in human history didn't begin with violence? What if they began with words, with ideas, whispered, repeated, normalized, until they felt like truth? Because the story of the Holocaust is not just about what happened, it's about how it became possible. It's about how millions of people were slowly taught to hate, to fear, to blame, and how one man turned that hatred into a machine of destruction. But to understand why Adolf Hitler hated the Jews, we must go back far before him, far before World War II, far before the rise of Nazi Germany. Because this story didn't start with Hitler. It started with something much older. For centuries in Europe, Jewish communities lived as minorities, often separate, often misunderstood. They had different religious practices, different traditions, and in many cases were excluded from mainstream society. Over time, this separation turned into suspicion. Suspicion turned into prejudice, and prejudice turned into something far more dangerous. During the Middle Ages, false accusations spread, claims that Jews were responsible for plagues, economic problems, or even supernatural evil. These lies had no evidence, but they didn't need it, because fear spreads faster than truth. And once fear takes hold, it becomes incredibly difficult to remove. By the 19th century, these old religious prejudices began to evolve into something new, something more modern and more dangerous. It was no longer just about religion, it became about race. Jews were no longer seen as people with a different belief system, but as a separate, inferior group altogether. This idea became known as anti-Semitism, and it spread quietly, deeply, across parts of Europe. Then came a turning point in history, World War I. Germany lost. But the loss was not just military, it was emotional, psychological, devastating. The country was left humiliated, economically broken, and searching for answers. People wanted someone to blame. And in moments like this, blame becomes a powerful force. Instead of accepting the complex truth that wars are lost for many reasons, conspiracy theories began to rise. One of the most dangerous was the stab in the back myth, the false belief that Germany had not truly lost the war on the battlefield, but had been betrayed from within. And in this lie, Jews were often blamed, not because of facts, but because they were already seen as outsiders, already misunderstood, already vulnerable. This is the environment where a man named Adolf Hitler rose to power. Hitler didn't invent anti-Semitism, but he weaponized it. He took existing hatred and turned it into ideology, into policy, into a vision. In his book Mein Kampf, Hitler described Jews not just as enemies, but as a threat to the entire world. He portrayed them as controlling economies, influencing politics, and weakening nations. None of it was true, but that didn't matter, because when people are desperate, they don't always look for truth. They look for someone to blame, and Hitler gave them that. When he came to power in 1933, everything began to change, slowly at first, almost invisibly. Jewish people were excluded from jobs, from schools, from public life. Then came laws, like the Nuremberg laws, that stripped them of citizenship and basic rights. They were no longer seen as equals. They were turned into outsiders in their own country. Then came propaganda, relentless, powerful, everywhere. Posters, films, newspapers, all repeating the same message: that Jews were dangerous, that they were the cause of Germany's problems, that they were less than human. And when a society begins to see a group as less than human, anything becomes possible. Then came violence. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, where Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were attacked across Germany. It was a warning, but the world did not fully respond, and the violence escalated. When World War II began, the situation became even more deadly. As Nazi Germany expanded across Europe, millions of Jews came under its control. And then, the unthinkable, a plan, systematic, organized, industrial, the final solution, the decision to eliminate the Jewish population of Europe, not through random acts of violence, but through a coordinated system of ghettos, deportations, concentration camps, and extermination camps. Places like Auschwitz became symbols of unimaginable horror, where millions were murdered, not for what they had done, but for who they were. By the end of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews had been killed. 6 million lives, 6 million stories, families erased, children never given the chance to grow, a tragedy beyond words. But here's the most important truth. This did not happen overnight. It happened step by step, lie by lie, silence by silence. It happened because hatred was allowed to grow, because propaganda was believed, because people looked away. And this is why this story matters, today, more than ever. Because the roots of this tragedy are not locked in the past. They exist wherever fear replaces understanding, where difference becomes division, where people are judged not as individuals, but as groups. Think about the modern world. Social media, news, conversations. How often do we see entire groups blamed for complex problems? How often do we see stereotypes repeated until they feel real? It may not look the same, but the pattern is familiar. A young man scrolls through his phone and sees constant messages blaming a certain group for everything wrong in society. At first, he ignores it. Then he becomes curious. Then he starts to believe it, not because he is evil, but because repetition can shape perception, and perception can shape reality. That is how it begins. Not with violence, but with ideas. And that is why awareness matters. Because history is not just something we learn. It is something we must recognize when it begins to repeat itself. The Holocaust is not just a story about the past. It is a warning, a reminder of what happens when hatred is normalized, when truth is ignored, when humanity is forgotten. And so the real question is not just, why did Hitler hate the Jews? The deeper question is, how did so many people come to accept that hatred? And even more importantly, if faced with the same slow rise of fear, division, and blame, would we recognize it, or would we too look away?